Hello, welcome. Today I would like us to look at a video by a YouTuber called Shaun. His channel has around 76,000 subscribers at this point. The video we're interested in has around 124,000 views. The title of his video is A Response to Roaming Millennials, People of Colour, You're Not Oppressed. In the video, he takes issue with roaming millennials' view that people of colour in the US are not actually oppressed. Shaun's content leans towards left-wing social justice type content, while Roaming Millennials' channel is more right-wing and conservative. Both channels will be linked in the description box, along with a link to Roaming Millennials' original video and Shaun's response. So what is this argument actually about? In the original video, Roaming Millennial has taken issue with the students of Evergreen College who made claims that they suffer systemic oppression. In his response video, Shaun makes the counter-argument that actually they are systematically oppressed. He then goes on to make his counter-argument. Both reference the treatment of ethnic minority groups within the US justice system in support of their respective arguments. Now, Shaun is one of these YouTubers who leans towards somewhat subtle, nuanced argumentation. Often these are difficult to address, particularly in this instance because he uses the US justice system to support his position, which is itself a huge and complex issue, and these statistics are often difficult to interpret and very often don't lend themselves to certain types of analysis. He makes videos that, while on the surface seem reasonably argued, when considered as a whole, leaves one with a feeling that something is not quite adding up. The problem is in identifying where the missteps in reasoning are, and due to Shaun's style of argument, this is not a trivial task. The good news is we can resist the temptation to use a lot of pie charts, statistical tables, and academic papers, because we can address Shaun's arguments by careful reference to his own sources. Roaming Millennials' video was about 8 minutes long, and Shaun's response is around 20 minutes. So we won't be going through each point individually. We will only have time to address his use of sentencing disparities. The immigration side of the argument we will put to one side. Even so, that leaves several issues that need to be addressed. Let's listen to his introduction as our hero engages in a little rhetorical technique well beloved on the left, known as well poisoning.
Who is Roaming Millennial? Well, she's one of the YouTubers in the I'm not a racist, but vein. So she's not a racist. Okay, acknowledged she's not a racist, but she's got a few questions,
Well, that was a little passive-aggressive, don't you think? She's one of the YouTubers in the I'm not a racist, but vein. Unfortunately, Shaun, we don't, do we? Here, Shaun suggests that racism might be a possibility, but he shies away from openly making the accusation. He presents himself as being charitable, but it seems to be a grudging acknowledgement. It lacks sincerity. Shaun has played the racist card, and although he's moved it to one side, it's still on the table. This is a technique lifted directly from the pages of the left-wing playbook. We will later discover that the source that Shaun uses to support his position is less prudent.
Now then, Roaming Millennial makes several errors in this section. Some are errors of mathematics, some errors of omission, and a couple of contradictions of logic there too. I don't know where to start really, to be honest. But how about we start with this statement of Roaming Millennials. For oppression to be happening, black people would need to be incarcerated unjustly. You see, her point here is that black people are more likely to commit crimes than other races, so it makes sense for them to be a larger percentage of the prison population. So first of all here, what she does not examine, possibly on purpose, is whether or not these percentages match up, because that's important. And I'll give you two scenarios here. So, scenario 1. Let's say one group of people are 10% more likely to commit crimes than other groups of people, and also make up 10% extra of the prison population. Now that's what you'd expect in a fair system. At least without factoring wider society into our little example here anyway. Now, scenario 2. One race of people are 10% more likely to commit crimes than other races, but make up 30% extra of the prison population. Now that's unfair and unjust treatment, even accounting for that hypothetical group's higher relative criminality. Do you understand? So returning to reality, which of our little scenarios there more accurately reflects the criminal justice system in the United States? Well, one way to answer this question is to look not at how certain groups are treated within the system, but how individuals belonging to those groups are treated.
Now, we will pause here because we know that Shaun is focused on correcting errors in reasoning, and we have a potential problem. In this context, a population is a collection of individuals. Shaun's example individual would tell us nothing about the statistical population, in the same way as the statistics tell us nothing about the individual. As Shaun's position on the matter rests on a statistical argument, I'm not sure as to the reason why he makes such a distinction. When he makes the statement that one way to answer this question is to look not how certain groups are treated within the system, but how individuals belonging to those groups are treated, then that seems to indicate a fundamental misapprehension. In short, it's a nonsense. Anyway, let's continue.
And here's a study from 2013 from the Yale Law Journal entitled Mandatory Sentencing and Racial Disparity, Assessing the Role of Prosecutors and the Effects of Booker. And I'd like to read you a few lines from their conclusion. We agree that the high rate of incarceration of black men is a serious social problem, and that examining the possible contribution of disparities in the criminal justice system is important. Our research suggests that in the federal system, disparities in the post-arrest justice process contribute to this problem. After controlling for the arrest offence, criminal history and other prior characteristics, sentences for black male arrestees diverge substantially from those of white male arrestees by about 10% on average. While this disparity does not seem to be growing, it is persistent. So, did you like that study? Because here's another. This is a United States Sentencing Commission report entitled Report on Continuing Impact of United States v. Booker on Federal Sentencing. And what did that find? The Commission's updated multivariate regression analysis showed, among other outcomes, that black male offenders have continued to receive longer sentences than similarly situated white male offenders. And how much longer were their sentences? This is from later in the report. For example, sentence length for black male offenders exceeded sentence length for white male offenders by 19.5%. And I should note here that I found both of these reports in an article responding to Roaming Millennial on Pathos.com, which I will link in the description.
So basically that's his main argument. Subtle, isn't it? He's not arguing that the injustice is in the overrepresentation of African American males in the crime statistics, but rather the perceived injustice comes later, during sentencing. And in support of this, Shaun cites two studies that he claims supports his position. But did you detect the trick? Let's take a close look at the paragraph he quoted from one of the conclusions of the 2013 study titled Mandatory Sentencing and Racial Disparity. One of the conclusions the authors made, and was quoted by Shaun, is, "We agree that the high rates of incarceration of black men is a serious social problem, and that examining the possible contributions of disparities in the criminal justice system is important. Our research suggests that in the federal system, disparities in the post-arrest justice process contributes to this problem. After controlling for the arrest offence, criminal history and other prior characteristics, sentences for black male arrestees diverge substantially from those of white male arrestees by about 10% on average. While this disparity does not seem to be growing, it is persistent." That is what the authors wrote in the study. Now listen carefully to Shaun's summary of the author's conclusion.
So that's fairly clear cut there, I think. On an individual level, controlling for all the factors except race, black men still get longer sentences than white men. And because they get longer sentences than white men, they will on average be in prison for longer, and therefore at least some part of their overrepresentation in the prison system is accounted for by this unfair sentencing.
There we have the trick. Did you detect what it was? Nowhere have the authors suggested that the disparities are unfair due to racial bias or unjust. They quite clearly state that the overrepresentation of African American males is a serious social problem. But that concern does not an injustice make. The point is, Shaun has quoted from an academic study that is 80 pages, and nowhere do the authors come to the conclusion that the disparity is driven by racial discrimination within the justice system. In fact, as one would imagine, they offer several potential explanations that do not entail racial bias. But Shaun ignores these alternative explanations suggested by the authors in favour of his own conclusion. Most of the possible explanations suggested by the authors of the study are quite technical in nature. The study is intended for a particular audience, which is familiar with the detail and technical aspects of the judicial system. Perhaps two of the most readily understood for the layperson is past criminal history influencing prosecutors in selecting charges that have mandated minimum sentencing. The other is the aggravating circumstances within particular categories of crime. For instance, if a particular demographic is more likely to be armed when committing any crime, then the prosecutors are more likely to push for the more serious charge, which often has a mandated minimum sentence. So there may well be demographic difference even within the same category of criminal offence, given the criminal history of the accused and the nature of its commission. Perhaps the most bizarre element in his argument, which is quite inexplicable, is his use of both studies in support of his argument. Why would I say this? Because the first study, titled Mandatory Sentencing and Racial Disparity, heavily criticises both the methodology and the conclusions of the second report he used, which was published by the Sentencing Commission. The first study was published as a response to the second, and by academic standards, harshly critical of the Sentencing Commission report. This criticism is clearly stated in the first study's abstract, and I quote, "In contrast, we use a dataset that traces cases from arrest to sentencing, allowing us to assess Booker's effects on disparities in charging, plea-bargaining, and fact-finding, as well as sentencing. We disentangle background trends by using a rigorous regression discontinuity-style design. Contrary to other studies, and in particular the dramatic recent claims of the US Sentencing Commission, we find no evidence that racial disparity has increased since Booker, much less because of Booker. Unexplained racial disparity remains persistent, but does not appear to have increased following the expansion of judicial discretion." This criticism is sustained throughout the entire study. A single representative example from the study, which can be found in the introduction on page 3, states the following, and I quote, "The most prominent study to date, a 2010 report of the US Sentencing Commission, gave an alarming answer. Booker and its judicial progeny had quadrupled the black-white sentencing gap among otherwise similar cases, from 5.5% to 23.3%. In January 2013, the Commission issued an update with similar figures, revising the latter figure slightly downwards to 19.5%, this time combined with explicit calls for legislation, in effect returning the guidelines to something fairly close to their prior binding status." This leaves the reader in absolutely no doubt in relation to the author's considered assessment of the second study used by Shaun to support his argument. So we have two studies. The first, an 80-page detailed dismantling of the second, but both presented in support of the argument. I'm not really sure how to summarise this, but total bollocks might be a fair description. But how did he arrive at this sorry state of affairs? Well, I have my suspicions. I cannot know, but what I believe to be the case is that Shaun has based his entire argument not on the studies, but on the Pathos article's selective use of the studies. When we view the title to the Pathos.com article, which Shaun displayed in his video, but could not quite bring himself to articulate, we might suspect a particular bias on the part of that article's author. We could leave matters rest at this point, but so far all we have is a classic case of cherry-picking. The original author either did not care, or more likely had not realised that the first paper was published primarily to challenge the conclusions contained within the second. So before we finish, we should consider a third paper, which was published a year later by the same authors as the first paper. And this paper directly addresses the issue. The paper is titled Racial Disparity in Federal Criminal Sentences and contains some relevant observations, the first of which is contained within Section B, Case Defendant and Characteristics, and I quote, "However, these differences may not be solely the result of race. The black and white defendant pools differ on two key legally relevant dimensions. First, black defendants on average have more extensive criminal histories. Only 20% of black defendants are in the lowest criminal history category, compared with 45% of white defendants. Second, there are differences in the distribution of arrest offences. Table 1 contains the distribution of arrestees across broad offence categories. For example, black defendants are more likely than white defendants to be arrested for weapons offences. Black arrestees are also more likely to have at least one aggravating factor noted in the written description of the arrest offence. In addition, there are differences in observables that, while not legally relevant, could be correlated with case outcomes. In particular, socio-economic status. Black arrestees are more likely to be sufficiently poor to qualify for a publicly funded attorney, 85% compared with 60%, and 43% of black arrestees are high school dropouts, compared with only 29% of whites. This paper will also be linked in the description box below. It is more relevant to the discussion because, unlike the first used by the Pathos author in the original article, and later by Shaun to support his position, this paper directly addresses the issue. It is published by the same authors, so Shaun obviously believes them to be a reliable source, as he uses their study in support of his argument, so I doubt he could now discount their expertise or challenge their actual conclusions at this point. What can we conclude from all the studies, publications and articles? Well, it's not as simple as some would have us believe. For instance, the chances of facing federal charges are actually greater for white arrestees than for black arrestees. In Table 2 of the 2014 study, this is stated as 97.9 for white and 97.6 for black. So if there is a bias in the system, it is not apparent at this stage, as blacks have a marginal advantage. But even though this is a marginal difference, it's not a difference one would expect to be generated within a system biased against that demographic. There is a significant difference in sentencing, however, but the authors of these reports do not believe the disparity is generated by inherent racial bias within the system, but rather suggest socio-economic, cultural influences and criminal histories. We end our adventure at this point. I hope you found something of interest in this video. If you would like to support my channel, I now have a Patreon page. If you're unable to support my work through Patreon, then you can share, like or comment. It's all good. Thank you for watching.